There are looking glasses that outlive the houses that hung them. In the autumn of 1911, a dealer in a town at the edge of the Virginia mountains began taking back the old mirrors he had sold, the kind made before the war. Every customer told him the same thing. They had looked in and seen not their own face, but a place on fire, a settlement in a hollow they did not know. He told himself it was a flaw in the old glass, a stain in the tin. He was wrong, and the truth of where that glass came from is the kind of thing the mountains keep. Before we go any further, I want you to do something. Look in the description of this video and in the pinned comment at the top of the comments. There is a link there to something I've been putting together for a while, called the Appalachian Dossier. It is a record of accounts that were quietly erased from official American records between 1843 and 1891. Reports filed by sheriffs and surveyors and country doctors that were burned or locked away or written over by men who decided the public should never read them. The link is down there. Go look at it now, or come back to it after. It is waiting. Now. The man at the center of this account was named Ephraim Toland, and in the autumn of 1911 he was 49 years old and running a trade in old things out of a narrow storefront in the town of Glade Spring in Washington County, Virginia. Glade Spring is a town the railroad passes through on its way to somewhere more important, and his shop sat on the street that ran parallel to the tracks, close enough that the goods on his shelves rattled when the freight went through. He was narrow through the shoulders and long in the face, sunburnt in the way of men who had worked outside before they worked inside, and he kept a beard trimmed short with a straight razor every Sunday, whether the shop had hot water or not. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years handling old glass, the kind of hands that did not quite uncurl all the way when they rested on a counter. He had a soft voice, and he almost never raised it. The people who sold to him said you could tell Ephraim was uneasy only because he got quieter, never louder, and the quiet itself was the thing to watch for. He did not drink, and he did not lie. If he told you a looking glass was made before the war, it was made before the war, and you could set your money on it the way you set your pack on a flat stone. His trade was estates and barn clearings, and the slow emptying of households where the last resident had died and the kin wanted the building clean. He bought what the county did not want and what the families could not carry. And over the years he had developed a particular feeling for one object above the rest, the looking glass, the framed mirror. People called them old without knowing what old meant, and Ephraim could date a glass by its tint and by the way it caught the light, and by the faint, sweet, metallic smell the back of it gave off when the room was warm. He knew the old glass the way other men knew the rooms of their own house, and he could tell you, without picking a pane up, whether the backing was tin amalgam or the later silver, because the amalgam gave a cooler, bluer light, and the silver gave a warmer, yellower one. And because the old amalgam had a smell, faint and sweet and metallic, the smell of a metal that is slowly coming apart. The new glass he sold too, when it came through the door, but he did not have a feeling for it, because the new glass was stable and stayed what it was. It was the old glass that interested him, the glass that was still changing, still moving, still not finished with whatever it had been made to do. That was the glass he watched. That is the man we are dealing with. A careful man, whose living depended on knowing exactly what he was selling, and on being right about it. What happened to him that autumn began, the way these things begin, with an ordinary day and an ordinary sale, on a Tuesday in early October, when a farmer named Harlan came back through his door, carrying a looking glass he had bought the week before. Harlan was a big man, slow to speak, and he set the glass down on the counter with the care of someone putting down an animal he did not trust. He had bought it for his wife, for the parlor of their place up the creek. And Ephraim remembered the sale because the glass was a good one, a pre-war looking glass in a walnut frame, the kind of pane that carried the pale bluish tint of old tin amalgam. Harlan had paid $4 for it and counted the coins out twice. He did not want his money back. Or rather, he did, but that was not why he had come. His wife had looked into the glass the night before, late, with the lamp turned low, and what she saw in it was not her own face. She saw a place on fire, a cluster of cabins along a creek with smoke standing up into still air, and figures moving between the buildings, not running the way people run from a fire, but moving in the slow way of people who have been doing something for a long time. She covered the glass with a bedsheet, and she would not go back into the parlor, and in the morning she sent Harlan down the mountain with it. There was one more thing Harlan told him, almost as an afterthought. It was the thing Ephraim wrote down first when he got out his ledger 2 weeks later. The farm had a yard dog, a rangy blue-tick hound that slept on the porch and went wherever the family went, and after the night his wife looked into the glass, the dog would not cross the threshold of the parlor. It would come down the hall and stop at the door and stand there with its ears forward and its weight shifted back, and it would not go in, not for food, not for a kind word, not for anything. The wife had not been the first to notice the glass was wrong, because the dog had refused the room before any person in the house understood why, and the people had taken longer to catch up, because people always take longer, because people talk themselves out of what they already know. Ephraim heard him out, and did what a careful dealer does. He examined the glass. The surface had the glittering quality of a mercury mirror that has begun to go, those small points of light that look less like a reflection and more like frost forming on a window. And there were cloudy patches in the lower third, where the tin had oxidized into dark and yellow-brown bands. Anyone who handled old glass knew the corrosion patterns, the dark clouding, the concentric bands of tin oxidation, the little bright points where the surface has begun to crystallize, and a pane that had gone far enough could throw shapes in a low light that the eye mistakes for something real, the way a stain on a wall looks like a face when the lamp moves, and he had seen it fool people before. The tin mercury backing was unstable by its nature, and after 50 years it began to come apart on its own, and a glass coming apart on its own can show a person something that was never there. He told Harlan the pane had spoiled, which happened, and he refunded the $4 and carried the glass into the back room. He was certain of his read. He set the glass on the shelf with the tarnished ones, meaning to scrape the backing and resilver it when he had time, and he thought the matter was closed. There was one detail he noticed and set aside. Along the bottom edge of the frame, in the groove where the glass sat, there was a bead of something dark and heavy, the size of a match head. Mercury. The liquid metal migrated down through the amalgam as the mirror aged, driven by gravity, and pooled at the lowest point of the frame. Ephraim had seen it before. He wiped the bead away with his thumb, and he did not think about it again for 2 weeks, which was how long it took for the second mirror to come back. The second return came from a circuit preacher's wife over in the next county, a woman named Ada Carmody, who had bought a small oval looking-glass from Ephraim at a church sale in the spring. Ada was a careful woman, the preacher's wife, and she had a reputation in the county for not being given to fancies, which is the word people used for the things they did not want to believe. She came into the shop holding the glass at arm's length, wrapped in a towel, and she set it on the counter the way Harlan had set his, with the care of someone handling a thing that might bite. Her account was the same as Harlan's wife's, and she gave it in the same unwilling way, as though she were confessing to a fault she did not commit. With the lamp low, she had seen a settlement burning in a hollow, cabins along a creek, smoke and figures moving. She would not keep it. The third came 11 days later, from a widow whose late husband had bought a tall pier glass from Ephraim 2 years before he died, for the front hall of their house on the ridge. The widow had not looked into it herself. Her grown son had, late one night on his way to the privy, and he had come back into the kitchen white in the face, and asking his mother whether anyone had ever lived up the branch, in the hollow, because there was a town burning in the glass, and it was not his face. 3 returns in a month, and that is not a story. It is a problem. Ephraim stopped treating it as spoilage. He wrote to each of the 3 buyers and asked them to come in, separately, on different days, and to describe what they had seen without hearing anyone else's account. He sat them down one at a time in the back room, with a ledger open on his knee, and he asked the same questions in the same order, and he wrote down what they said. The accounts matched, and they should not have. 3 strangers, in 3 houses, looking into 3 different mirrors, described the same hollow, the same number of cabins, the same creek bending the same way at the lower end, where the water turned against a shelf of rock, the same smoke rising straight as though there were no wind, the same figures moving slowly between the buildings. It was the kind of agreement that does not happen by chance, because chance produces differences, and there were none. He read the 3 accounts back to himself that night, one after the other, and the thing that held him was not the buildings or the creek or the smoke. It was the motion. All 3 of them had used the same word for the figures in the hollow, or near enough. The figures were not running. They were moving, Harlan's wife had said, in the slow way of people who have been doing something for a long time. The widow's son had said the people in the glass were walking, not fleeing, walking from building to building as though the fire were their work and they were tending it. Ada Carmody had said they moved like people at a task. 3 strangers, in 3 houses, looking into 3 mirrors, and all 3 had seen people who were not afraid of the fire. And that detail, more than the cabins or the creek, was the one Ephraim could not set down to spoilage, because a flaw in the tin does not tell the same story 3 times, and it does not give the figures in the story the same intent. Ada Carmody, the preacher's wife, added one detail the others had not offered, and she gave it the way a person gives a thing they would rather have kept. There was a figure standing near the creek, she said, away from the buildings, not moving with the others. It was standing still. It was watching. She said it the way she might have said that someone had been standing at her window, and she did not look at Ephraim when she said it, and he did not ask her what the figure was watching, because he understood that she had already told him. After the 3rd buyer left, Ephraim went into the back room and stood for a long time with his hands flat on the counter, staring at the shelf where the 3 mirrors sat with their faces to the wall. Then he did what he had always done when something did not make sense. He went to the object. He carried all 3 mirrors out where the window light could reach them, and set them side by side on the long table. He lit a single kerosene lamp and held it close. This time he was looking at the glass, not at the frames, and not at what anyone had seen in it, but at the pane itself. The 3 pieces of glass were the same. They carried the same pale, bluish tint, the tint that told you a mirror was tin mercury amalgam, and not the later silvered kind, because silvered glass reads yellow, and amalgam glass reads blue. They held the same small seed bubbles through the body of each pane, in the same pattern, along the same diagonal, and in one corner of each of the 3, they showed the same shallow crescent flaw, a little nick in the surface where something had touched the pour before it set. He laid the 3 panes corner to corner and matched the crescents. They were pieces of one sheet. The bubbles lined up across the joins, and the flaw lined up too. 3 looking glasses, sold to 3 different households out of his own shop over 3 different years, had been cut from a single sheet of glass. This was unusual, but it was not impossible, and Ephraim knew it. Large plate glass was expensive before the war, and hard to come by in the mountains, and a single whole sheet cut into several smaller looking glasses and sold separately over time, was exactly the kind of provenance a careful dealer could trace. The new silvering process, the one a German chemist named Liebig had worked out in 1835, had begun to replace the old amalgam method by the 1860s, but the changeover was slow, and out in the counties the old bluish glass was still being cut and sold well after the war. A sheet poured in the old way, in the late 1850s, would carry exactly this tint, and exactly this instability, and exactly this slow leak of mercury to the bottom edge. He checked the bottom edge of all three. The bead of dark liquid was there in each frame, the same size, in the same place, as though the three pieces were still part of one sheet, and the mercury in them was still trying to run downhill toward the same point. He stood back from the table. A man who sells old glass for a living knows what it means to find one sheet behind several mirrors, and what it means is a story. Because a sheet of plate glass in the 1850s, in the mountains, was not a common thing. It was the kind of object that got made once, at some cost, in one place, by one set of hands, and then it traveled, and the places it traveled to, and the hands it passed through, were a chain that could be followed. He had 3 links of that chain on his table, cut to 3 different shapes, and the rest of the links were out there, in the counties, in other mirrors he had sold over the years. 14 of them from the same estate, and he did not yet know how many of those other buyers had seen the hollow too, and simply not brought the glass back. The question changed for him in that room. It was no longer what his customers had seen. It was where this one sheet had come from, and a question like that had an answer, because a single sheet had a single pour, and a single pour had a single foundry. Ephraim kept a purchase ledger going back to the year he opened the shop, a tall columned book with the date and the seller and the object and the price written in his own careful hand. He also kept a running file of estate sales he had bought from, with the name of the deceased and the county record where the sale was filed. He started there. He traced the 3 mirrors backward, buyer by buyer, through his own sales records, and all 3 lines converged at the same estate sale 8 years earlier, in the winter of 1897. The estate of a man named Oren Vail, who had died the previous winter out near the headwaters of a creek the county maps called Reed's Fork. Ephraim had bought a quantity of looking-glasses from the Vail estate, 14 of them, all sizes, all in plain frames, and he had sold them off 1 and 2 at a time over the next several years. The 3 that had come back were among the 14. This is what the ledger shows. He turned then to the county record, and to the file the clerk kept on the estate, and the picture that came up out of the paper was a strange one for a man who sold glass. Oren Vail had been a traveling glass seller. For the better part of 40 years he had walked the mountains of the Cumberland Plateau and the Virginia counties with a handcart, selling looking-glasses 1 at a time to farm wives and preachers and storekeepers and anyone who wanted a mirror and could meet his price. He kept no shop and owned no wagon. The glass went on his back in a wooden crate lined with straw, and he sold it and walked on. Up and down the creeks he was known for one thing besides his trade. He never bought glass from anyone. Every looking-glass he ever sold, he had cut himself, from a single sheet he carried, wrapped in sacking in the bottom of the crate. And when a piece was sold, he did not replace it, but cut the next piece from what remained of the same sheet, and sold that, and walked on. Here was a man who sold pieces of one sheet for 40 years, and never once bought glass to replace it. Ephraim turned the pages of the county file, and found the inventory of the estate. It was a short list: the handcart, the wooden crate with the straw lining, a few plain frames unassembled, the wrapping of sacking, and the notebook. There was no other glass. A glass seller who died leaving no glass, because the glass was all gone, because he had spent 40 years cutting it off the one sheet and carrying it out into the mountains 1 piece at a time, and when the sheet was finished, there was nothing left of his trade but the empty crate and the cloth he had wrapped it in.
Ephraim read that twice and sat with it. The sheet was the whole of Oren Vail's trade, and the sheet was the whole of his life, and he had given it away, one looking-glass at a time, across the counties, like a man paying off a debt he could not finish. Before we go any further, let me say something. This account is being told to you by the fear behind you. If you have made it this far without subscribing, tap that button now, and if you are hearing this on a channel that is not ours, someone has taken our work without permission, and you should report it for us. Now let me get back to Ephraim. Ephraim closed the ledger and went out to Reed's Fork. It is a branch creek that runs down out of the ridge country east of Glade Spring, and the road to it leaves the county route and turns to gravel, and then to dirt, and then to grass, and then it stops being a road at all. He asked at the farm at the mouth of the branch, and at the church, and at the store that sat at the crossroads 3 miles down, and he asked the oldest people he could find, because the oldest people are the ones who keep the names the maps have dropped. The hollow was called Vail Hollow. It sat up a branch off Reed's Fork, between 2 ridges, where a good spring came out of the base of a limestone cliff and ran down across a flat before it joined the creek. The Vail family had settled there in the 1840s, at the spring, because a spring is the reason a man picks a place in that country and no other. A dozen cabins went up over the years, and a meeting house, and a glass foundry, because the Vails were glass people, and the ridge above the hollow was karst, full of caves, and the sand they hauled out of those caves was the kind that made good glass when you fired it right.
It burned in October of 1859, the whole hollow in a single night, every cabin and the meeting house and the foundry. Ephraim could not find the fire in any county book. There was no report, no inquest, no record of a death, no record of a survivor, no record that the hollow had ever been on fire at all. It was not lost in the way a paper is lost, but let go, the way a thing is let go when the people who remember it decide not to speak of it, and the people who come after them never learn the words. He walked up the branch himself on a cold gray morning. The road was a grassy track now, grown over with laurel so thick he had to turn sideways in places, and a tree had come down across it where the spring forked. There was nothing left at the top but a lone chimney standing in the brush, the rectangular lines of foundation stones in the woods where the cabins had been, and the spring still running, clear and cold, out of the base of the cliff. The foliage had taken everything else. 50 years of mountain growth had closed over the hollow, the way water closes over a stone dropped into still water. The survivors had scattered, the way people scatter when a place burns, and there is nothing to come back to. Some of the young men went into the war a few years later, and died in it, and what they knew about the hollow went into the ground with them. Those who lived did not speak of it, not to the census taker, not to the county clerk, not to their own children. The public road was built up on the ridge line instead of through the branch, and the families who might have remembered the hollow moved out to the road for the sake of access, and the hollow closed behind them. Nobody went back. Ephraim asked one of the old men at the store whether anyone had ever said how the fire started. The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then he said that the people who would have known that were gone, and that the ones who were left had decided a long time ago that the hollow was not a thing to talk about, and that he was not going to start now. That is the kind of no a man gives when he knows the answer, and has made his peace with not giving it. This is the worst kind of archive, the kind no one keeps. A place that was real, that had a spring and a dozen cabins and a foundry, that had people in it, erased not by catastrophe, but by silence, and by time, and by the small convenience of a road built somewhere else. Ephraim stood at the spring and understood that the hollow he was looking for was not on any map, and that the only people who could have named it were dead or would not, and that the glass in his back room might be the only piece of the place left in the world. The county clerk had one more record. It was the one that turned the account. When Oren Vail died without kin in the winter of 1896, his few possessions went to the county for unpaid taxes, and among them was a notebook, a small stitched booklet of cheap paper that the clerk had filed with the estate and forgotten. Ephraim found it in a box in the back of the clerk's office, dusty, the pages soft with age, and he carried it home and read it at his counter under the lamp. It was Oren Vail's own account. He wrote it over a span of years, in a hand that changed as the booklet went on. This is the part of the manuscript where the handwriting changes, and you can see it if you turn the pages. Up until the middle of the booklet, the writing is steady and even, the writing of a careful man recording careful facts, the weather and the price of glass, and the names of the creeks he walked. After a certain line, the letters lean forward, as if the pen were being pushed by a hand that had begun to hurry, and the lines run a little crooked, as if the writer could not quite hold himself still. Oren was the founder's son, 20 years old in 1859, the journeyman at the foundry, the one who tended the poor. He writes that the night the hollow burned was the night they finished the largest sheet the foundry had ever poured, a single sheet of plate glass bigger than a door, poured flat and rolled smooth and left to cool on the stone. What started the fire he does not say. He says the sheet was still warm when he wrapped it in sacking, and that he carried it out through the creek bed, down the branch, with the water of the creek around his knees, and that the water was warm too, warmer than it should have been, and that he did not look back at the bank. He carried the sheet down the mountain that night, and he never went up the branch again, not once, in the 37 years he had left. Here is where the account stops being about a man and starts being about the glass he carried. The notebook says he walked in the creek for a long time, because the creek was the one way down that did not pass the cabins, and that the water was up to his thighs, and the sheet was heavy against his chest, and the sacking was wet, and you could feel the warmth of the glass through the cloth, the warmth of a thing that had just been made and had not yet cooled. He walked until the water got shallow, and the branch opened out onto the creek below, and only then did he climb the bank on the far side, away from the hollow, and he did not turn around. For the rest of his life he cut the sheet into looking glasses, a few each year, and sold them one at a time across the counties, and he never told a buyer where the glass came from. What he writes is that he could not bring himself to let the sheet go whole, and he could not bring himself to break it, and so he gave it away in pieces, slowly, the way a man pays off a debt he will never finish, a looking glass at a time, until the sheet was gone and only the notebook was left. There is one more entry, and it is the entry that explains the cloth. Oren writes that after the fire he went back to his own people's house, the one that had not burned, and he covered every looking glass in it with cloth, and he never uncovered them again, not for the rest of his life. He had grown up with the old belief, the one the mountain people kept and the people in the towns were beginning to forget. When someone dies, you cover the looking glasses in the house, with crepe or with a sheet or with whatever cloth you have, so that what is inside the glass cannot look out. You cover them because the dead are gone, and you do not want them looking back at the living through the silver of the glass. Oren covered his mirrors because he knew what was inside his, because he had put it there, and he did not want it looking out at the people he sold the pieces to. A man who covers every mirror in his house for 37 years is a man who knows what he is carrying. The sheet was still warm when he wrapped it. The water of the creek was warm. He did not look back at the bank. He writes those things, and he does not explain them, and the not explaining is the part you are meant to notice, the part that tells you the man writing it had begun to be afraid of what he was writing. Ephraim sat with the notebook open and the 3 mirrors in the back room, and he put the 2 accounts together, the buyer's and Oren's, in the lamplight. He understood what he was holding. What the customers had seen was not a memory of a fire that had happened 50 years before. A memory does not move. What they saw was the hollow as it burned that night, the cabins, the smoke, the figures, still in motion, the night still happening inside the glass, the way a held breath is still happening in a body. The sheet had been poured that evening and carried out that evening, and what was inside it was that evening, and it had not finished, and it was not going to finish, because there was nothing inside the glass to let it finish. And there was the figure by the creek, the one Ada Carmody had named and the others had not. In Oren's account, there was only one person standing at the creek that night, not running with the others, not moving at all. It was Oren himself, 20 years old, with the wrapped sheet in his arms, standing in the water and not looking back at the bank. The figure in the glass was the one who had carried the glass out.
The one who had made the record was inside the record, and he had been inside it for 50 years, standing in the creek, holding the glass he had carried out of the hollow. The covered mirror custom opened up for Ephraim then, the way a lock opens when you finally have the key. You cover a looking glass when someone dies, so the dead cannot look out. Oren had covered his mirrors because the hollow had died that night, and he had put the hollow inside the glass, and he did not want it looking out at the families who bought the pieces. The buyers who looked too long, with the lamp low, had done what Oren had spent his life trying to prevent. They had lifted the cloth. They had let it look out. And here is the thing Ephraim understood last, and it is the thing I want you to sit with. Every customer who brought a mirror back had made the same complaint, if you knew how to hear it. None of them said they had seen a fire. They said they had seen a place, and the place had people in it, and one of the people had been standing still and watching. What they were bringing back, every one of them, was not a mirror that showed the wrong thing. It was a mirror in which something had shown itself, and then would not stop watching, and the watching was the thing they could not name, and could not stop. The wrongness was not in the glass. The wrongness was that the glass was being looked out of. There was one more thing he understood, and it was the thing that decided what he did next. Oren had sold the looking glasses, one at a time, over 40 years, to families spread across the counties, and he had sold them to people who would hang them in lit rooms and look into them in the daytime, when the glass shows only the room and the face. What Oren had counted on was that no one would look in at night, with the lamp low, when the room goes dark and the glass goes deep. The buyers who brought the mirrors back had all done the same thing without meaning to. They had looked in after dark, in a quiet house, and in that darkness the glass had stopped being a mirror and become a window, and on the other side of it the hollow was still burning, and the figure in the creek was still standing, and it had turned its head. Ephraim did not know whether it could turn its head, or what the figure was. He knew only that 3 people had described it watching, and that a man who had carried the glass out of the hollow had covered every mirror in his house for the rest of his life, so that it would not. That was the part that kept him up. Ephraim did not sleep that night. He sat at the counter with his back to the back room and the lamp burning low, and he did not go in, because going in would have meant looking, and he was not ready to look. He kept the 3 mirrors. He did not resell them, and he did not refund them out to be sold on by someone else, and he did not break them, though he thought about breaking them for a long time, standing in the back room with a glazier's hammer in his hand. Then he wrote to the 3 buyers, and told them he would hold the glass for them if they ever wanted it back. And he meant it, though he knew none of them would ask. One night late in November he turned the lamp low, and went into the back room and looked into the last of the 3 himself. He saw the hollow and the fire, the creek and the shelf of rock where the water turned, the figures moving between the buildings, and the figure standing in the creek with the wrapped sheet, still, watching. It looked at him. He looked at it, and he did not look away, and he did not cover the glass. He left the 3 mirrors where the morning light would reach them, facing the back wall of the shop, and he did not cover them, and he did not destroy them. His reasoning was plain. He wrote it down in the ledger in his careful hand. The hollow is not on any map, and the county book has no record of the fire. The spring still runs, the foundation stones are still there, and no one alive will name the place. The glass is the only record left of a place that was real, and to break it would be to let the hollow burn down for good, and to cover it would be to leave the figure standing in the creek, alone, with no one to see that it had ever stood there at all. He kept the record lit, in other words, because a record that no one looks at is the same as no record. The last line he wrote in the ledger was not a line of trade. He wrote that the figure in the creek had been standing there for 52 years, and that in all that time, the only people who had seen it were the ones who had bought a piece of the sheet and looked in after dark, and that he did not know whether the figure knew it was being seen, and that he had decided it was not his to decide whether it should be. Whether that was mercy is a question I will leave with you. A sheet of old glass, carried out of a burning hollow in 1859, cut into pieces and sold one at a time for 40 years, is still in the world, in a back room in Glade Spring, and it is still the night of the fire inside it, and the figure in the creek is still standing, and it is still watching, and the lamp in that back room still goes low at night. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. The town, the country, the road if there is no town. I read every one of them. The Appalachian dossier is in the description and the pinned comment. The records they tried to keep buried, the ones the clerks wrote over, waiting for you. Subscribe, because the mountains are not done keeping.